What happens when a single piece of jewelry exposes the lie that has defined 3 generations of your family's existence? What if the minimum wage struggles that shaped every decision you've ever made were actually the result of a calculated conspiracy to keep you from claiming an inheritance worth hundreds of millions? For Rachel Stone, a 31-year-old catering server working Denver's most exclusive country club events, that world-shattering moment came disguised as a routine Saturday wedding reception. For Margaret Covington, the oil dynasty matriarch whose energy empire powered half the American West, it was the instant her carefully guarded secret began to unravel after 33 years. She was just trying to earn enough overtime to pay her disabled father's nursing home fees. She was just another wealthy patron celebrating her granddaughter's wedding at the exclusive Pine Ridge Country Club. But when Rachel noticed the antique ruby pendant hanging from Margaret's platinum chain, identical to the one her late mother had worn until the day she died, a simple compliment would trigger a revelation that had been buried since 1989. This isn't a story about coincidence. This is about how one woman's determination to understand her family's past exposed a betrayal so systematic, so ruthlessly executed, that it had condemned 2 generations to poverty, while their stolen birthright built an energy empire that stretched from Texas to Alaska. But one Saturday evening, a single ruby pendant would change everything. Pine Ridge Country Club sprawled across 200 acres of Colorado's most pristine landscape, its golf courses and tennis courts creating an oasis where Denver's elite escaped the pressures of running companies worth billions. The Tudor-style clubhouse commanded views of the Rocky Mountains, while manicured gardens provided the perfect backdrop for weddings that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Rachel Stone had been working Pine Ridge's exclusive events for 4 years, invisible to the oil executives, tech entrepreneurs, and real estate moguls who gathered there to celebrate milestones in lives of unimaginable privilege. At 31, she had mastered the art of graceful service, black uniform pressed to perfection, dark hair swept into an elegant updo, movements fluid and silent as she navigated between tables, where casual conversations involved acquisitions worth hundreds of millions. The work paid better than anything else available to someone without a degree, but every shift reminded her of the vast gulf between her world and theirs. She lived in a cramped apartment in Aurora, working multiple jobs to cover her father's care at Sunrise Manor, where early-onset Alzheimer's had robbed him of his memories and his independence at only 62. David Stone had been a geologist for a small energy exploration company, spending his career analyzing rock formations and soil samples in hopes of finding the next big oil discovery. He'd been brilliant at his work, but terrible at office politics, passed over for promotions despite discoveries that had made his employers millions. Now he sat in a nursing home chair, staring out windows without recognition, while Rachel worked double shifts to pay for care that insurance barely covered. Her mother Linda had died 3 years ago, taking with her most of the family's stories and all of their mysteries. Linda Stone had been a quiet woman who'd cleaned office buildings at night, but she'd possessed one beautiful thing, an antique ruby pendant that she wore every day, treating it like a talisman against the world's cruelties. "It belonged to my mother," Linda would say whenever Rachel asked about its origins, "back when our family had prospects. Before everything fell apart." She'd never elaborated. And now the pendant sat in Rachel's jewelry box, too precious to wear to work but too meaningful to sell, even when the nursing home bills made her consider pawning everything else of value. Tonight, Pine Ridge buzzed with the celebration of the Covington-Hamilton wedding, a merger of 2 energy dynasties that would create one of the largest privately held oil companies in America. Rachel recognized most of the guests: the pharmaceutical heiress who owned half of Denver's skyline, the mining patriarch whose copper mines had built Colorado, the energy baroness whose drilling operations had transformed the American West. At the head table sat Margaret Covington, matriarch of Covington Energy and grandmother of the bride. At 78, she still commanded attention through sheer presence, silver hair arranged in an elegant chignon, pale blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her navy Oscar de la Renta gown was cut with architectural precision, and she wore her vast wealth like a second skin, natural and unquestioned. Rachel had served Margaret dozens of times at various club events over the past 4 years. She always sat in positions of honor, always conducted business even at social gatherings, always tipped exactly 20% while treating the staff like well-trained furniture. As founder and CEO of Covington Energy, she controlled drilling operations from the Gulf of Mexico to the North Slope of Alaska. As Rachel approached to refill Margaret's champagne glass, something caught the ballroom's crystal lighting at the older woman's throat. A ruby pendant hung from a delicate platinum chain, and Rachel's breath caught. It wasn't just similar to her mother's, it was absolutely, impossibly identical. The same teardrop-shaped ruby surrounded by tiny diamonds, the same intricate platinum setting that suggested Art Nouveau craftsmanship. But what truly stopped Rachel cold was a distinctive inclusion in the ruby that she'd memorized from countless examinations of her mother's pendant, a tiny star-shaped flaw that created a unique light pattern when viewed from certain angles. Margaret's pendant had the exact same flaw. "More champagne, Mrs. Covington," Rachel managed, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. Margaret looked up from her conversation with the senator's wife, mild irritation crossing her features at the interruption. "Please," she said dismissively. The words escaped before caution could intervene. "That's a stunning pendant. My mother had one exactly like it." Margaret Covington went completely still, her champagne glass suspended halfway to her lips. Her pale eyes focused on Rachel with sudden, uncomfortable intensity, while conversations at nearby tables seemed to fade into background noise. "Excuse me?" Rachel's heart hammered against her ribs. "The ruby pendant. It's identical to one my mother treasured. Even the little star pattern inside the stone." The glass slipped from Margaret's manicured fingers, crystal shattering against the parquet floor. The sharp crash cut through the ballroom's elegant atmosphere, drawing startled looks from wedding guests who were accustomed to flawless service. "That's impossible," Margaret whispered, her cultured voice shaking. "This pendant has been in my family since 1955. It's absolutely unique." Rachel felt the attention of other guests turning toward their corner of the head table. "But ma'am, I held my mother's pendant countless times. She wore it every day until she died. Said it was all we had left from the good times." Margaret stood abruptly, her tall frame casting a shadow over the elegant table setting. She pulled a $100 bill from her purse and dropped it beside the broken crystal, more than Rachel made in an entire shift. "What was your mother's name?" The question came out sharp as broken glass. Linda Stone, Linda Marie Stone. The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. She gripped the back of her chair for support, her knuckles white with strain. "We need to talk," she said, her voice hollow with some emotion Rachel couldn't identify. "Not here. Monday morning, 10 o'clock. She paused, studying Rachel's face with the intensity of someone memorizing crucial evidence. "Covington Tower, executive floor. Tell security you have an appointment with me personally." She walked away without another word, leaving Rachel standing among the scattered crystal shards while the wedding celebration continued around them, her world spinning off its axis. The drive home to Aurora felt surreal. Rachel sat in her 15-year-old Honda, surrounded by Saturday night traffic, trying to process what had just occurred. An energy baroness, one of the most powerful women in American business, had reacted to her mother's pendant as if it contained the key to her own destruction. The contrast between Pine Ridge's opulence and her neighborhood was jarring. Aurora's working-class streets felt like another planet after the manicured perfection of the country club. Tired strip malls and aging apartment complexes replaced designer boutiques and pristine golf courses. Rachel had grown accustomed to moving between these two worlds daily, but tonight the transition felt like falling from grace into reality. Her small apartment felt even more cramped after Pine Ridge's grandeur. The 3 rooms she'd called home for 5 years suddenly seemed impossibly small. A cramped living room that doubled as her office. A galley kitchen barely large enough for one person. A bedroom that held little more than a bed and dresser. Medical bills covered every surface. Physical therapy invoices for her father's care, pharmaceutical costs that insurance refused to cover, facility fees that seemed to multiply monthly. Rachel made herself tea, the cheap brand from the grocery store, a far cry from the imported varieties served at Pine Ridge, and sat at her tiny kitchen table, staring at the framed photograph of her parents that occupied the central spot on her bookshelf. Linda smiled back from the frame, wearing the ruby pendant and standing beside David in happier times, before his illness had stolen his memories and her death had left Rachel completely alone in the world. The pendant itself lay in a small jewelry box on her dresser, wrapped in the same faded tissue paper Linda had used to protect it for decades. Rachel retrieved it now, holding it up to the harsh fluorescent lighting of her kitchen. The ruby caught the light like captured fire, its star-shaped inclusion creating the distinctive pattern that had somehow connected their modest existence to Margaret Covington's vast empire. "It's not for selling, baby," Linda had insisted during her final weeks, her voice weak from the cancer treatments that had ultimately failed to save her. "No matter how bad the bills get, you keep that pendant. It's all we have left of better times, before everything went wrong. Someday you'll understand why it matters." At the time, Rachel had assumed her mother was being sentimental, clinging to the only beautiful thing in a life marked by financial struggle and health crises. Linda had worked night shifts cleaning office buildings for 30 years, coming home before dawn with swollen feet and aching hands, never complaining, but never quite hiding her exhaustion. She died at 58. Worn out from decades of physical labor that had barely kept them afloat. Now Rachel wondered if Linda had known more than she'd revealed. Had she understood the pendant's true significance? Had she carried the weight of knowing that their poverty was artificially imposed, rather than simply the result of bad luck and limited opportunities? Unable to sleep, Rachel spent the weekend researching everything she could find about the Covington family empire. What she discovered painted a picture of energy industry dominance that stretched back to the 1950s. The company had been founded in 1955 by Robert Covington, who'd used mysterious financing to purchase his first drilling rights in West Texas. His success had been immediate and seemingly impossible. A young man with no industry experience who'd somehow known exactly where to drill, finding oil on sites that established companies had dismissed as worthless. Robert's son, William, had expanded the business throughout the Southwest during the energy boom of the 1970s, while William's daughter, Margaret, had modernized Covington Energy for the global market, establishing operations from Colombia to Kazakhstan. Under her leadership, the company had become one of the world's largest privately held energy corporations. But as Rachel dug deeper into industry publications and geological surveys, she found inconsistencies that seemed deliberately obscured, references to partnership agreements that appeared once and were never mentioned again, technical innovations that were credited to Covington personnel but seemed to have appeared fully formed without any research and development history. Most intriguingly, she discovered a brief mention in a 1960 Petroleum Industry Journal about the Stone-Covington Geological Partnership that revolutionized Western oil exploration. The article was fragmentary, but it suggested that there had once been a technical collaboration between the families that had been dissolved following the tragic death of senior partner James Stone in 1961. By the 1970s, all references to any Stone involvement had disappeared from industry records. It was as if an entire partnership had been systematically erased from energy sector history. Monday morning found Rachel standing before Covington Tower, a gleaming 50-story monument to energy industry power that dominated Denver's business district. The building housed not just corporate offices, but also geological laboratories, engineering departments, and trading floors that influenced global energy prices. Security was more intense than she'd expected. Former military personnel who ran comprehensive background checks before escorting her to a private elevator that ascended directly to the executive floors. The ride seemed endless, carrying her up through layers of corporate hierarchy she'd never imagined she'd experience. Margaret's office occupied the entire top floor, its walls lined with geological surveys, industry awards, and photographs of her meeting with presidents and prime ministers. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered commanding views of the Colorado plains, where oil derricks dotted the landscape like mechanical flowers. Margaret waited behind a desk that looked like it belonged in a palace, but she wasn't alone. A man in his 50s sat across from her, his sandy hair and pale eyes marking him as family, despite his obvious discomfort with the situation. Beside him sat a younger woman, perhaps 40, with Margaret's same commanding presence and the kind of confidence that comes from inheriting power. "Rachel Stone," Margaret said as she entered, her voice carefully controlled. "This is my son, William Covington III, and my daughter, Patricia Covington-Hayes. They're curious about your family history." William rose with obvious reluctance. "Miss Stone, I hope you understand that this is highly irregular. We normally don't meet with the help." Rachel cut him off, her working-class directness slicing through his diplomatic evasion. Patricia studied Rachel with uncomfortable intensity. "With people making extraordinary claims based on jewelry, no. We weren't aware that any artifacts from that period had survived." "What period?" Rachel asked. Margaret moved to a wall safe, hidden behind a painting of an oil derrick. She withdrew several folders, their contents yellowed with age. "The period when our families were partners, Miss Stone, when Stone and Covington discovered the largest oil reserves in Colorado." History, the documents she spread across her desk, told a story that shattered everything. Rachel thought she knew about her family's past. Geological surveys showing that her grandfather, James Stone, had been the genius behind Covington Energy's early successes, identifying oil deposits through innovative analysis techniques that revolutionized the industry. Partnership agreements indicating that the Stone family should have owned half of what became a billion-dollar empire. "Your grandfather was the real geologist," Margaret said quietly. "Robert Covington had money from family real estate investments, but James Stone had the vision, the technical expertise, the geological intuition that made us successful." "What happened to him?" William shifted uncomfortably. "There was an accident in 1961, a drilling platform collapse that killed 3 workers, including your grandfather. The investigation was inconclusive." "You mean you killed him?" Rachel said, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia examined her manicured nails, while William studied the geological maps covering one wall. "Not killed," Margaret said finally. "But we didn't save him either." "There were safety protocols that could have prevented the accident. Equipment upgrades that Robert chose to delay because they would have reduced quarterly profits." She opened another folder, revealing documents that painted a picture of systematic negligence. Safety reports showing known structural problems with the drilling platform. Equipment maintenance records indicating repeated delays in crucial repairs. Most damning of all, insurance policies that had been secretly increased just weeks before the accident. "After James died, your grandmother Helen received a settlement from the company," Patricia said. "She signed agreements that terminated the partnership and released us from all future claims." "How much?" Rachel asked, though she dreaded the answer. $50,000, Margaret admitted, plus monthly payments that continued until her death in 1983. Rachel's mind reeled. $50,000 for half of what had become a billion-dollar empire. Her grandmother had been bought off for a fraction of what her family was owed, leaving Linda and David to struggle in poverty while the Covingtons built their dynasty on stolen geology. "The pendant," she whispered. Was Helen's engagement gift from James, Margaret confirmed. He'd had it specially made using rubies from a mine he'd discovered during his graduate work in Burma. When she signed the settlement agreements, she kept the pendant as the only proof of what they'd shared. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Helen Stone had worn the pendant as a reminder of her murdered husband and stolen inheritance. Linda had inherited both the jewelry and the pain, understanding that their family had once mattered, but never knowing the full extent of what had been taken. "Where is she buried?" Rachel asked. "The Riverside Cemetery," William said softly. "Section C, Plot 47. We've maintained the grave since 1983. Guilt money," Rachel said. "You've been paying for flowers and maintenance because you knew what you'd stolen from her." Margaret nodded slowly. "It seemed like the least we could do." "The least you could do would have been honoring the partnership agreement," Rachel shot back. "The least you could do would have been ensuring my father grew up knowing he was heir to an energy empire, instead of believing he was the son of a failed geologist." She stood abruptly, her working-class composure finally cracking. "My father is dying of Alzheimer's in a nursing home, forgetting everything he ever knew about geology while sitting on an inheritance worth hundreds of millions. My mother died cleaning office buildings at night, never knowing she was the daughter of a woman who should have been one of the richest people in Colorado." "What do you want from us?" Patricia asked. Rachel looked at them, these people who'd built their fortune on her family's stolen expertise, and felt cold determination settle over her. "I want the truth told," she said. "Publicly. In industry publications, in your own corporate history, in geology textbooks. I want James Stone's name restored to every discovery he made, every innovation he developed. The scandal could destabilize the entire company," William protested. "We have thousands of employees, shareholders, obligations. Then you should have thought of that before you built your empire on murder and theft," Rachel replied. "You have 1 week to publish a full acknowledgement of the Stone family's contributions, or I take this story to every media outlet in the country." Margaret reached for her checkbook. "Perhaps we could arrange some kind of private compensation." "I don't want your money," Rachel said firmly. "I want justice for my grandfather, recognition for my grandmother, and acknowledgement that the Stone family were the real discoverers of Colorado's oil wealth." She moved toward the door, then paused. "And I want access to everything. Geological surveys, partnership records, safety reports, every document that mentions James Stone or the drilling platform accident. I want to understand exactly how you murdered him." The elevator doors closed, carrying her back down through the layers of power built on her family's stolen genius. But Rachel Stone was no longer the same woman who'd entered Covington Tower. She was no longer just a catering server struggling to pay nursing home bills. She was the granddaughter of James Stone, rightful heir to an energy empire founded on stolen geological expertise. And she was going to reclaim what had been taken from her family, no matter the cost. The media firestorm that followed began with Margaret Covington's own conscience. 5 days after their confrontation, she published a full-page letter in the Denver Post, the Houston Chronicle, and the Wall Street Journal, acknowledging the systematic erasure of James Stone from Covington Energy's history. "The geologist we forgot, how James Stone discovered Colorado's oil wealth and was written out of history, ran across multiple newspapers, accompanied by previously sealed geological surveys and partnership documents." The letter, signed by Margaret personally, detailed how the Stone family's contributions had been deliberately minimized following James's death in 1961. The response was immediate and devastating. Energy industry publications began investigating other companies' founding stories, questioning how many technical breakthroughs had been falsely attributed to corporate executives rather than the geologists who'd actually made the discoveries. The American Association of Petroleum Geologists announced a comprehensive review of historical credit for major oil finds throughout the American West. Covington Energy's stock price collapsed as investors questioned the company's ethical foundations. Environmental groups seized on the safety violations that had led to James Stone's death, demanding investigations into current drilling practices. Congressional representatives called for hearings on industry safety standards and corporate accountability. The personal impact was equally profound. Rachel used the media attention to establish the James Stone Memorial Fund, providing scholarships for geology students from working-class backgrounds and supporting families of workers killed in energy industry accidents. Most importantly, she was finally able to afford the best possible care for her father. David Stone was moved to a private facility specializing in Alzheimer's treatment, where innovative therapies helped slow the progression of his disease. On his good days, he was able to read about his father's restored reputation, understanding that the Stone family name had finally been cleared. 6 months after that transformative Saturday evening at Pine Ridge Country Club, Rachel stood in the newly renamed James Stone Memorial Laboratory at Covington Energy's headquarters, watching geologists analyze core samples using techniques her grandfather had pioneered. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, the Colorado Plains stretched toward the horizon, no longer a landscape marked by stolen wealth, but a reminder that truth, like oil, has a way of eventually reaching the surface. A single ruby pendant, worn faithfully by women who refused to let their family's story be erased, had finally brought its owners home. Rachel Stone had walked into Pine Ridge Country Club as invisible service staff and emerged as Rachel Stone Covington, guardian of a geological legacy that had been buried but never truly lost. Sometimes justice arrives like a gusher, powerful, unstoppable, and impossible to contain once it breaks through to the surface. Sometimes it comes quietly, carried by a working woman who refused to let her family's expertise remain uncredited. Helen Stone's pendant had finally fulfilled its purpose, and the empire that tried to erase the Stone name would forever honor it in recognition of the geological genius that had made their fortune possible. This story reminds us that every family has its buried truths, every fortune has its hidden foundations, and sometimes it takes someone from outside the circles of power to bring recognition to the technical expertise that power claims as its own. If this tale of perseverance, justice, and the ultimate triumph of scientific truth over corporate theft moved you, share it with someone who believes that every innovation deserves proper attribution. Like this story, and subscribe for more tales that prove no discovery, no matter how deliberately obscured, can remain uncredited forever when determination demands its due recognition.